What is the price of elite performance? What makes the top 1% the top 1%? I think about this question so much because I have spent a lot of my life chasing the idea of being elite, of being incredibly good at something so that I can get X reward or achieve X goal. And I'm sure a lot of people also think about this concept a lot, even if you don't call yourself elite or call the skill set that you need to achieve something elite. This is kind of the same concept that most people think about whenever they're striving towards their goals, when they're trying to dream big and achieve something big. When it comes to me personally, I've done bodybuilding, powerlifting, marathons, HYROX, all at an extremely obsessive level. I've chased personal records and tried to achieve the best physique possible, all under this umbrella of trying to be elite. I had this idea that I was going to be one of the best athletes in the world in terms of being one of the most well-rounded athletes. And part of that was genuine curiosity and ambition, right? Like I just genuinely wanted to see what I could accomplish. I felt ambitious and I felt passionate about these projects that I'm working towards in fitness and health and athleticism. I'd always research different athletes like Michael Jordan or Kipchoge, who is a marathon runner, who was the first one to break sub 2 hours, although it wasn't really under fair conditions from Nike. But we won't talk about that. And then Usain Bolt, Rafael Nadal, one of my favorites, Michael Phelps. And I've learned a lot about sports psychology from Coach Steve Magnus, who was a Nike whistleblower and a really well-renowned endurance coach nowadays, especially in running. But also a big part of why I chase the idea of being elite is part of it was comparison. I think a lot of people do this, and including myself. Social media constantly exposes us to people who are stronger, richer, faster, leaner, more successful, or more disciplined. And society rewards elite performance, right? The top 1% are the top 1% for a reason. They make more money, they have cooler things, they have more respect, more societal status, more status symbols. And so, depending on who we compare ourselves to, it can either really inspire us or it can make us feel inferior. Or if I don't know if some of you guys have done this, but I sometimes I'll dismiss them as obsessive or cringe, or I'll belittle their passion or their obsession for whatever they're chasing. And sometimes criticizing another person's ambition is an honest judgment, but sometimes, a lot of the times, it's can be psychological self-protection. Like I don't want to try that hard because it's irrational to try that hard. It doesn't matter that much, right? I've caught myself saying that a lot to kind of protect my own ego. But anyway, getting back to the main question of what actually separates average performance from great performance and great performance from elite performance. And as a clarification, elite does not necessarily mean famous. Like the top 1%, you might not know who they are. They might not even be on social media. Elite is like partly statistical, right? It's like how good can you be and have unusually rare performance capability or consistency in a certain area. And sometimes being elite can be one narrow domain, but someone else could also be unusually capable across many domains. So if you're great at a lot of things, that can make you elite in overall. But if you're really elite in one narrow domain, like one sport, like an elite athlete, you're still elite. You just, might lack the skill set in a lot of other areas of your life. Kind of the same concept of being a specialist versus an expert generalist. I personally respect the expert generalist a lot more, where you're kind of an expert in a lot of generic categories rather than specializing in one narrow category. And I also want to clarify, this is something we'll talk about later, but being elite is not necessarily a good thing. There's a lot of trade-offs to being elite, and it's usually not worth it for most people. It can actually be quite unhealthy, and it's up to you to decide if you really want that elite level of performance. So what exactly separates elite performance from average and great? I think a lot of people here will say talent. Like, what does that even mean? Talent matters, but it's definitely not the whole explanation, right? Genetics matter, who your parents were, your environment matters, where you were born, where you were raised, what was around you, what you have access to. Resources matter. Coaching matters. Did you have a great coach? Did you have great mentorship? Timing and luck obviously matter. The hard work that you do exposes you to more luck, in my opinion, to more opportunity. Michael Phelps did not become Michael Phelps through mindset alone. Like, obviously, he has great body proportions for swimming, his physiology, and had really early development that all mattered. Also, performance enhancing drugs also matter a lot, especially if you're an elite athlete. Pursuing a sport, enhancing your physiology through hormones and drugs certainly helps you become more elite and top 1% in certain categories. Not to mention like certain drugs, like testosterone, a lot of hormones are actually psychoactive as well. So they can actually improve goal oriented behavior or increase risk taking behavior and pain tolerance. So your willingness to chase after a goal, or even though it's uncomfortable, will actually increase as a result of being on these drugs. So it's not just a physical boost, but a mental boost. But this isn't a physiology lesson on performance enhancing drugs. But overall, talent does not explain why gifted people can underperform, why less gifted people can become exceptional, or in my coaching practice, why two clients with very similar lives and circumstances produce completely different outcomes, or why some people keep improving long after others plateau. The way I like to think about it is talent may determine where your ceiling is, but behavior determines how close you get to that potential. So in my eyes, the biggest difference between average, great, and elite performers is not simply just motivation, like the will to perceive a goal. Obviously that matters, but it's more so specifically the relationship they have with discomfort, feedback, obsession, and sacrifice. Now, what the heck does that mean? Let's get into it. Relationship with discomfort. An average person, the relationship with discomfort, the goal is something they would like to achieve, but it's not really essential to who they are. They might have a more diverse identity. They care about other things. It's not really their top priority. They might change their behavior whenever it feels convenient. It's not super necessary or dire to them. They often wait to feel motivated. They don't really rely on discipline or systems or willpower to get things done, or like, I'll do it when I want to. They also interpret discomfort as a sign that something is wrong, right? A lot of the times people are scared of discomfort. They're scared of change, especially average people. I'm not saying average, great people and elite people are good or bad, right? These are all different lifestyles, ways of living. And also, the average person typically wants progress, but they're not always willing to have the trade-offs required to create it, right? They'd rather be more comfortable. They're not willing to embrace the discomfort that is needed to grow. Now, the next step to be great, the goal has kind of become a part of their identity and something they're genuinely proud of pursuing, right? In conversation, they'll bring it up as like, that's something that they do. That's something that's core to who they are. They accept discomfort when there's a clear reason for it. They can follow through despite low motivation. And a great person understands that progress often involves inconvenience, right? They will absolutely embrace discomfort for delayed gratification. But these people still obviously need periods of stability and recovery. They get burnt out when chasing that goal too intensely. And they, in total, kind of derive a healthy amount of meaning or identification with the goal. Not too obsessive, but also not too little. The final level of elite, their identity becomes so deeply intertwined with the goal. It's no longer just something that they do. It's who they are, right? They get separation anxiety from their goals, right? Like hitting the gym, if they're wanting to be a bodybuilder, dead set on being a bodybuilder, taking a rest day gives them freaking anxiety. Okay. Not meal prepping makes them feel like they're failing their entire life. And they build their entire life around tolerating repeated discomfort. They love discomfort, actually. They want to embrace it. Whenever they feel uncomfortable, they're like, this is where I'm getting better. They want it. They look for it, right? They don't treat discomfort as an emergency. They're actively seeking that discomfort because they know that's where they can grow and get better. And these people may eventually actually become too tolerant of suffering and ignore legitimate warning signs. And I'm going to give a personal example here. I'm not going to say I'm necessarily elite, but I've been in a lot of competitions. I've seen a lot of elite athletes. I've raced alongside, competed alongside a lot of elite athletes. I've studied a lot of them. And I have done, quote unquote, elite things like marathon runners. Like there's only a very small percentage of people who ever actually run a marathon. I run a marathon. I've done 6 HYROXs at this point. I've run 2 half marathons. I've done a bodybuilding show, powerlifting competition. So I've done a lot of things at a pretty high level. I'm not the best by any one of them by any means. But I'd say I could compete at almost every single one of those at a regional competition and place in the top 1%. Um, but as a personal example, it kind of reminds me of myself in many ways where I had an unhealthy obsession with these goals, where I would, when I first started running for marathon training as an example, my heart rate would reach 170, 180 beats per minute. I would feel this sense of like I couldn't get enough air. My legs were burning. And that's the point where I got the most motivated, where I would just turn into like some weird animal, like dude, just like super obsessed with the pain I'm in. I'm like, this is where I'm getting better. This is where I'm adapting. This is what I live for. And looking in, you'd be like, this guy's a freaking psycho. Like, why is he talking to himself on a run on a treadmill about telling us how to adapt to the pain? Like, what is this guy on? And eventually it got to a point where I became way too tolerant to the suffering it was giving me. I was ignoring warning signs. My eyes were twitching. My tinnitus flaring loud. I was sleeping worse. I got injured frequently, and I kept going because I identified with this goal of being an elite athlete so much. And it's a tough situation to be in, because when you spend so much time, so many months putting in the training for a marathon or whatever it might be, could be a business, could be a different goal, and you realize it's not good for you, but you've already invested so much of your identity into that thing and you have to learn how to detach from it. That's a lot of stress in and of itself. And it's something I've been personally having to learn to get away from, because it's not sustainable. Being elite is definitely not sustainable. And I think there's an important nuance here, and it's that the elite person is not necessarily tougher in every area of life. I'm definitely not tougher than a lot of other people in certain areas of life. Definitely not. And definitely elite athletes are not as great in other areas of life as others as well. Elite people might simply just be unusually willing to suffer for one specific goal compared to the average person. So that's a relationship with discomfort. What's the difference between average, great, and elite with the relationship with feedback? Average people often experience feedback as criticism, right? If you hear feedback, I think this is our kind of baseline. We hear feedback from somebody and we're like, don't tell me what to do or how to live my life. How do you know what I should be doing? You're not better than me. And they want reassurance before correction. They're like, hey, you're doing okay. You're doing good, but you need to change this. They can't just hear the feedback. They might defend the current behavior instead of examining it. They're like, example, as a coach, I'd say, hey, you're not being consistent with calorie tracking or whatever it might be. They'd be like, oh yeah, it's because this last week I did this, this, and this, and there's just ran out of time. There wasn't much time. And instead of just being like, okay, yes, I can definitely fix on that, they're like defending the behavior constantly. And they apply advice, once it only feels really comfortable. And sometimes the average person even thinks they know better, or will belittle the feedback because they're afraid of getting their ego hurt. And that's understandable. I think all of us have done that at times. The next level of being great, again, they can receive feedback without making it entirely personal. They're like, yeah, that kind of sucks, but I understand why I need to get better in this area. They ask a lot of questions. They're wanting to expose their weaknesses more often. They test the recommendations that they're given, and they ultimately learn to separate identity from performance. With elite, these guys are freaks. Again, they actively seek correction. Like they almost like have a sense of bliss when they're told they're doing something wrong. They're like, this is something I can fix. Thank you so much for telling me. They'll actively ask, like, what am I doing wrong? They want their weaknesses to be exposed. They apply feedback extremely quickly. They often overcorrect with that feedback. And they may become like so improvement focused that nothing ever feels good enough. In fact, elite people tend to have this kind of background of never really feeling quite good enough with who they are or where their life is at. So average performers protect their self-image, and elite performers are more willing to damage their self-image in order to improve reality. Third thing, relationship with attention. With the average person, Much of life is reactive or subconscious. They live more like a primal animal, right? Like you have a cat or a pet, they just react to things if they're not particularly intelligent or self-aware. You shake the food box, they come around to the food. They hear a loud noise, they're like freaking out. So behavior is mostly shaped by convenience, environment, mood, and social norms. They have very little willpower to change their circumstances outside of what was given to them and what's predetermined for them. They have goals that might exist, but they do not consistently organize their daily decisions around those goals. And they often need things to be interesting and fun to pursue something, right? They're kind of on that hedonic treadmill. They don't really like the idea of delayed gratification unless there's a very clear rational reason as to why they're doing it. Being great, on the other hand, they have clear priorities and they might center their days and weeks around these priorities and goals more often. They plan more deliberately. They might have a to-do list, calendar, a lot of things that they organize themselves and their thoughts with. They notice a lot of patterns in themselves and their environment. And they can delay gratification when the goal matters enough. Elite, again, just total nutcases here, allocates a disproportionate amount of attention to the goal. Even if it doesn't make sense, they're up at like 1 a.m. just like thinking about this thing or working on this project to get them closer to the goal. They think about it during work, before sleep, and they'll talk about it in ordinary conversations. They might get lost in conversation with this. The other person's sitting there like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Can you please shut up about X goal or his freaking like macros and bodybuilding? If you guys can't tell, bodybuilding's been on my mind recently for some reason. And they build routines, relationships, environments, and identity around X goal. Elite people craft their entire life to serve that goal, right? The goal becomes psychologically dominant. And this is where obsession enters. Elite performance usually requires an abnormal amount of attention directed towards something most people would not care about that deeply. They are obsessed over that thing. And it can be in a very unhealthy way. And lastly, the relationship with sacrifice, right? What are average versus great versus elite performers willing to sacrifice in order to achieve X goal? Average people, they might want the result, but they want to preserve most other parts of their life. They don't want to change much about them. They just want the outcome. Progress is slower, but the lifestyle may be more balanced overall for them, and that's acceptable. It's an acceptable trade-off. In coaching for me, these are the people that struggle to meal prep. They have to be reminded to send check-ins in. Tracking data is like a massive burden to them, which is all understandable, right? If you're not incredibly ambitious towards something or you don't have a clear rational reason as to why you're doing it, you're not super obsessed over that goal. Like tracking data obsessively is probably not for you. On the other hand, next level of being great at something, you are going to start making deliberate trade-offs to achieve it. They understand that saying yes to one goal means saying no elsewhere. There's a trade-off to everything, and they understand that concept really well. They can pursue excellence while preserving, some flexibility. So, they'll be really great, consistent at showing up to get better at something, but they're pretty flexible with their schedule, or they're okay with, maybe skipping a workout or, a project or like a time block that they had for work, if there's a good enough reason or if they feel like they need some rest. And ultimately, they understand that tracking data and meal prepping, as an example, are a part of the lifestyle, even if they don't necessarily enjoy it. So they'll continue doing these things, even if like every time they do it, they're like, screw this. Elite, on the other hand, again, weirdos. And that's what makes them elite. They're weird. They accept sacrifices most people would consider unreasonable, right? Social life, spontaneity, comfort, health, relationships, or identity may all become secondary to whatever they are pursuing. The sacrifice is not always noble because of this, right? They can become selfish in a way. They can start serving a thing rather than serving themselves and their relationships more. And sometimes elite performance is produced by insecurity, fear, compulsion, or an inability to feel satisfied, right? They probably had an upbringing where they didn't feel like they were enough. That's not always the case, but often they're just very uncomfortable being present. They have a hard time being grateful. Not seeing progress makes them feel worthless. They have a very strong tie to materialistic gain and their self-worth, which gets you a lot in this life and society, gets you a lot of respect, but again, not very sustainable if you think about it all that much. And these people also unusually enjoy data tracking. Like these are the optimizers, especially in my coaching practice. These are people that like track their HRV, they track their heart rate, resting heart rate, they track their sleep, they track their workouts. I prescribe them calorie or macro targets, and they're hitting that thing on the dot within like 1% error or discrepancies. And they cannot perceive life without certain things. And the concept of being a great athlete or a bodybuilder or someone who really cares about their health, they cannot perceive life without like meal prepping. It gives them anxiety to literally go a week without prepping their meals or being on point with their nutrition or not going to the gym. They feel like they're losing a sense of themselves. And the fact that they cannot do the thing that they want to do, that they're obsessed with, they're going to experience like grief, literal grief over the thing that they want to do, whether it be running, whether it be lifting weights, whether it be training for a sport or building a business, whatever it is. And this leads into an unhealthy amount of obsession. And you can see this with people like Michael Phelps or Tiger Woods and a lot of elite performers actually, where, they're on the record saying a lot of their training or their periods of life while they were becoming the best in the world at golf and swimming was clouded by a lot of negativity, right? They became the best by having a lot of unhealthy behaviors. Tiger Woods, I believe it was his coach or his dad, I think his dad was his coach, would treat him really brutally in a lot of workouts and a lot of practices so he could tolerate that discomfort and tolerate the negativity so that he would develop a strong mindset. And so he developed a really unhealthy relationship towards discomfort, toward negativity, where he would pursue like self-deprecating behaviors or whatever it might be and he would associate that with progress, right? So what this looks like in my coaching practice, because at the end of the day, I've coached hundreds of people at this point, all in different circumstances, all with different personalities, a lot of similar personalities, a lot of really different personalities. I have a little bit of a window into so many people's lives who are just slightly different, have different circumstances, do these certain things, have different values, different goals. And I think it's really interesting to compare these people against one another, even though I never really actually do that. I don't actually label my clients as like better than one than another, right? I would not literally label my clients as average or elite people, but I do think it's really helpful to compare, especially in my line of work, what makes someone successful versus what makes someone unsuccessful. What attributes can I take from the successful person and maybe apply to the unsuccessful person? So the trends that I see, because this really applies to life as a whole, not just my coaching, low performing clients, they typically communicate infrequently, right? They treat feedback as optional. I give them feedback, and rather than taking it at face value, they probably go out and do their own research a ton, and they probably make sure that I'm right about something or ask somebody else, and then they do it. And then they wait until a change feels comfortable, right? They're not like immediately applying the feedback. It could be 6 weeks when their work gets a little bit easier. Then that's when they'll apply it. They can rationalize their inconsistency incredibly well. Often really intelligent people are low performing, ironically, because they can self-negotiate in their heads to not be consistent in really elaborate ways and patterns. Like for calorie tracking as an example, like what is the point of calorie tracking? Like we were biologically evolutionary. They never designed a calorie track. We just kind of regulated our body weight and our composition by, hunger signaling and whatnot. And that's a great argument to make against calorie tracking. But at the end of the day, they're not losing weight and they're not making progress. So what the hell does that have to do with anything? Or, the low performing client will want the outcome, but they'll resist the structure, right? They'll want, to lose 10 pounds in 10 weeks, but they're not willing to calorie track. They don't want to go to the gym more than twice a week. They don't want to do cardio, etc. And these people might still progress, but very, very slowly, far from what's possible. And often values balance and comfort more than maximizing the result, which is not inherently a bad thing. But often a lot of the times these people think they're very ambitious and they think that they're very high performing, but it turns out they actually value freedom and flexibility a lot more than they originally thought. And a lot of these people also need exact outcome and numbers. They cannot really rely on their inherent passion or drive because they lack it. They don't really feel super passionate about this thing. They want an outcome and a number to make sure they're hitting their progress and doing the bare minimum. Kind of like how I approached all of my schooling. So the goal with these clients as a coach specifically is to address their mindset. I try to make them more committed, think about their values more often, and increase their goal-oriented behavior through mindset talk, journaling, speaking, actually talking about their goals more often, because these people typically, they don't have a lot of psychological, they typically don't hold a lot of space in their head for these goals. So I'm the only person that really wants to talk about them, talk about the goals with them. And I'm the only person that they feel comfortable talking about these goals for. So they spend very little time thinking about them or talking about them. And I'm that person. I have to be on top of that. Also to make them, I have to make them aware that they're not as ambitious or perfectionist as they once thought. A lot of people come in here thinking they're really ambitious or perfectionist over certain things. And part of it's like kind of understanding like, hey, you really don't want this as badly as you originally thought. And then it's about setting clear expectations of what they should expect moving forward. Now that they're willing to accept, they don't want to put in that much work. That takes quite a lot of self-awareness and, like facing your unconscious, facing your shadow, as Carl Jung would say, if you're familiar with that guy. Takes a lot of humility. For high-performing clients, these are people that communicate quickly and honestly, right? These are people that I love, but man, they reply and send me so many questions so quickly. I'm like, can you just like give me a break for a second? No harm, no foul there to the people that who I'm talking about. But they might apply corrections immediately. They track super accurately. I have to tell them to take time off. They organize their schedule around training and food. They progress much faster because the plan receives consistent exposure, and they rely more on passion and drive. They're not super concerned with exact outcomes or numbers because they're naturally high performing as a result of their tightly held values. So the shadow of that, though, right? Sounds great. Make good progress. You're like super disciplined. Society respects you. You have a great body. Awesome. But then what's the shadow to that? What's the trade-off, right? They may follow advice too literally. They overcorrect. They might panic over imperfect days. A lot of these people tend to have anxiety because they have this distrust in themselves or the process. They struggle to rest, to be still, to be present. They turn useful structure into obsession. Borderline OCD behaviors in a lot of these individuals who strive to be the best. And they may begin serving the process instead of the process serving them, right? We get into health, taking care of ourselves through exercise and eating well so that our body can serve us and that the food can serve us to live a better life. But sometimes we end up serving it too much, that we become a slave to the process. And so my goal with these types of clients, the high performers, is to promote more auto-regulation and less optimization. What is auto-regulation? It's like learning to listen to your own needs and to adjust the routine based off of those needs. And a lot of times it's pretty difficult because they will assume they need more. So my job is to get to understand they need less most of the time, and to actually act on that realization. And especially because a lot of them tend to be optimizers, is like, I want them to actually do a little bit less, maybe calorie track a bit more flexibly, maybe take more time off. And, on vacation, I specifically asked them, don't track anything. And that makes them aware of their obsession and they can learn to tame it, right? So, my average clients often need help increasing in commitment. And my elite-minded clients often need help putting boundaries around it. To wrap up, I want to make it clear that elite is not automatically better, right? Average is not an insult. I'm not doing that at all. A person may consciously just choose family, peace, freedom, or variety over maximizing one domain. And that's a totally respectable way to live. You can live a meaningful and happy life without being elite at everything. Elite achievement is often extremely, extremely narrow, right? You can be extremely good at something, but then totally neglect other areas of your life that are equally important or more important. Someone may be elite athletically and incredibly immature emotionally. We've seen a lot of athletes like that, haven't we? Elite professionally and physically unhealthy, right? Great business owner, great boss, but he's like 300 pounds and he had to go to the hospital like 3 times this last month. Elite intellectually and terrible in relationships, right? Super smart, able to freaking pop out essays, make a lot of money, whatever it is, but they can't stay in a relationship longer than 3 months. They make people feel bad about themselves. They're like borderline narcissistic, maybe. In my opinion, it's usually better to be a 90 overall player. I don't know if you've ever heard that kind of concept, but in like video games, I used to be obsessed with like Madden and like FIFA, and they had these like player cards, and they would list all the attributes, and the sum of all the attributes on average would list their their score, their overall score as a person, as a player. I think it's usually better to be a 90 overall player than a player with only one 100 level attribute, right? I'd much rather be the athlete that is like 80 to 90 level good on my sprinting, my agility, my control on the ball, my strength, rather than like having 100 level attribute on my sprinting and then like crappy 50, 40 level attributes on everything else. So being elite kind of describes the rarity of an ability or outcome. It does not describe the total quality or value of a human being at all. In fact, I would say the more elite that you are in general, the more materialistic you kind of get, because you're valuing external pressures and external rewards a lot more than you should. Because there's only so much intrinsic drive you can get from a certain passion project or a goal. I highly doubt, if you just a thought experiment, I highly doubt there would be any sort of Ironman competition if there were not great marketing, great promotions, great medals, great awards, and a great finishing line and other people to compare yourself against. No one in their right mind. Okay, I take that back. Probably somebody, but very few people would ever actually want to swim, I think it's 2 miles, bike over 100 miles, and then run a marathon back to back to back in one day, just because they think it's enjoyable. No, chances are they probably think they tell themselves that they think they enjoy it, but in reality, they just enjoy the process of feeling like they're elite, feeling like they're top 1% at something. Same thing with marathons, same thing with being first in a sport, same thing with being first as an entrepreneur, whatever it might be. So being elite and excellence overall has a cost. The real question is whether the cost matches your values, right? Some people want the appearance of elite results without the lifestyle that produces them. These are the people that freaking rent Lamborghinis for the weekend or go to Miami and like put themselves in a bunch of credit card debt just to have a nice watch on for dinner. Those types of people, like absolutely absurd. And others adopt an elite lifestyle for goals they do not genuinely care about. Instead, they're caring about something external, right? The validation they get for achieving those goals. That's where a lot of elite performers lie. They had expectations from their family, from their parents. They realized they could get a lot of dopamine, a lot of really quick validation by achieving hard things. Not because they enjoyed it, but because other people enjoyed seeing them do it, right? So how can you apply this? I'd say instead of thinking that being elite is the end all be all goal, which it absolutely is not, because I've tried to pursue it. Didn't go that well, right? It was fun while it lasted, but man, my body got burnt out physically, mentally. It just straight up sucked. I love the game, right? I love training. I love all that stuff. I'll always do it. But the level at which you need to pursue being elite is, as we discussed, requires so many trade-offs that probably not worth it for vast majority of people. So instead of thinking it's the end all be all goal, it's more helpful to think about which elite traits should you adopt during certain seasons of your life. What area of your life actually deserves more of you? Are you truly stuck, or are you unwilling to accept the trade-offs? Do you seek feedback or only reassurance? Do you have the self-awareness to even know that about yourself? Does discomfort make you retreat too early? Are your daily decisions organized around your actual stated priorities? Are you telling yourself you value and prioritize these things, but your actions don't actually follow through with the words that you're saying? Are you pursuing excellence because you value the goal or because you are trying to prove that you are enough? Right? That's an elite level mindset that needs to be addressed. That's not a healthy, sustainable fuel for an elite performer. Or do you need boundaries around an obsession that has already gone too far? Are you one of those people who considers yourself to be a high performer, an elite performer? Are you currently obsessed with something that really rationally doesn't make much sense and it's actually taking away from your life, and you need to start putting boundaries around it to live a better life? You do not need to become elite at everything, probably cannot, but you should decide consciously where you are willing to be average, where you want to become great, and what, if anything, is important enough to deserve an elite level of sacrifice.